Okay, so thank you very much. I thank everybody who is attending this section now and everybody who attended the seminar during the last 2 days and today. It's been a great event. It's been a great opportunity to meet a lot of interesting and intelligent and thoughtful people. And I thank especially Professor Agnaldo for idealizing and organizing such a great event. We are all grateful to him for having the conception of this and working so hard, because it was a really difficult task to make all this happen. And of course, I want to thank Professor Richard Swinburne too. He's been so kind to be here with us. He's such a renowned philosopher, such an important person. He decided to spend a few days with us here, just talking to us and teaching us and answering our questions. And he's been so kind. I'm sure sometimes my questions were not the smartest one he heard in his life, but he answered them with all his patience, all his kindness, and so I'm very grateful for him. Thank you very much, Professor Swinburne. So I changed the title of my text a little bit. Now it's in the plural, theistic arguments from the reliability of our cognitive faculties. So introduction, Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, henceforth the EAAN, is an argument for the conclusion that the conjunction of naturalism and evolutionary theory is self-defeating and cannot be rationally believed. Although the EAAN is not a straightforward argument in favor of theism, it doesn't seem difficult to derive from the material used to defend its premises an argument in defense of the existence of God. In fact, in his lecture notes, 24 or so theistic arguments, Plantinga includes, as argument K, an argument from the confluence of proper function and reliability. The argument says that theism is a better explanation to the reliability of our cognitive faculties than naturalism. All Plantinga offered in those lecture notes, however, was a brief sketch of the argument. In warrant and proper function, he offered a preliminary argument to his main evolutionary argument against naturalism, which sought to show that the reliability of our cognitive faculties is evidence against naturalism and therefore evidence for the only significant alternative, theism. This preliminary argument was shown to be deficient by Brandon Feitenson and Elliot Sober, and in Warranted Christian Belief, in the course of responding to their criticisms of the preliminary argument, Plantinga formulates, as we shall see, a probabilistic version of a theistic argument from the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Richard Swinburne agrees that a probabilistic theistic argument can be defended from the material presented by Plantinga in his EAAN. He says that if we regard E, that is evolution, as established, there is a correct P-inductive argument from E and R, our cognitive faculties are reliable, to the falsity of N, naturalism, and so to the existence of God, or at least some lesser God, who created our cognitive faculties and made them reliable. The goal of my paper is to explore how theistic arguments from the reliability of our cognitive faculties can be formulated from the material presented by Plantinga in his defenses of the EAAN. I began by presenting the most recent formulation of the EAAN. I then explored the possibility of formulating arguments based on inference to the best explanation, deductive arguments, and inductive ones. Second section, the evolutionary argument against naturalism. According to orthodox Darwinian evolutionary theory, we human beings are the product of a biological evolutionary process driven mainly by two mechanisms: natural selection and random genetic mutation. By virtue of the first mechanism, the generic mutations that are maladaptive and don't enhance fitness are discarded, and those that have adaptive value and enhance fitness are preserved as part of the genome. Our cognitive faculties then are the product of this process. But if naturalism, the thesis, as Plantinga defines it, according to which there is no God or anything like God, is true, this evolutionary process was unguided. That is, there was no supernatural guidance of this process with the aim of producing a certain kind of creature. But if this is so, why should we think that this process would have produced beings with reliable cognitive faculties? After all, natural selection will favor cognitive faculties and processes that result in adaptive behavior. But whether true beliefs will be formed is irrelevant for this process. Our behavior could be adaptive, but our beliefs false as often as true. Thus, unguided evolutionary process would not guarantee or even make probable that our belief-producing processes are for the most part reliable. The naturalist, then, by believing that the evolutionary process was unguided, is not in a position to affirm that it is probable that this process would result in creatures with, for the most part, reliable cognitive faculties that would be capable of forming mostly true beliefs. Plantinga therefore argues that the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable given naturalism and evolution is low, and that if I believe in naturalism and evolution and come to see that this probability is low, I have a defeater for my belief that my cognitive faculties are reliable. A Humean defeater, that is, a defeater that leads to the strongest possible version of skepticism. In where the conflict really lies, Plantinga presents schematically his latest version of the argument as follows. R being reliability of our cognitive faculties, N being naturalism, and E being evolution. First premise, the probability of R given N and E is low. Second, anyone who accepts, believes N and E, and sees that the probability of R given N and E is low, has a defeater for R. Third, anyone who has a defeater for R has a defeater for any other belief she thinks she has, including N and E itself. Fourth, if one who accepts N and E thereby acquires a defeater for N and E is self-defeating and cannot rationally be accepted. Conclusion, N and E cannot rationally be accepted. There are two theses in this argument, a probability thesis and a defeater thesis. Let's take a closer look at each of them. The probability thesis is a thesis that the probability of R given N and E is low. This thesis was initially defended by Plantinga by arguing that there are four mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustively ways in which belief and behavior can be related. The probability of R given N and E would be the weighted average of the probability of R given N and E and Pi for each of these possibilities. But in the most recent formulations, he has simplified the argument. He now defends that since most naturalists are materialists with respect to human beings, we should include materialism in the naturalist thesis, or for those unconvinced by this move, that the probability of R given N, E, and M is low. That is, adding M, materialism, to the conjunction of N and E. Now, from a materialist perspective, what sort of thing will belief be? Beliefs will have to be neuronal events or structures with two different sorts of properties. Neurophysiological or physical properties, and content or mental properties. It is in virtue of having content that a belief is true or false. My belief that interest in natural theology is growing is true because the proposition which constitutes its content is true. How are these two kinds of properties related? This question can be answered by the materialist in fundamentally two different ways. According to reductive materialism, content properties are reducible to neurophysiological properties. In other words, neurophysiological properties are the only kind of properties there are. According to non-reductive materialism, there isn't a relation of reduction of one kind of property into another. Instead, the relation here is one of determination or supervenience, with content or mental properties being determined by or supervening on neurophysiological properties. In both kinds of materialism, the capacity to form beliefs is something that arises as we move up the evolutionary scale. At a certain point in the evolutionary process, neural structures start to display belief content. The question then is, what's the probability, given E and N, which includes N, materialism, that the content is true? What is the probability, given E and N, that our cognitive faculties produce mostly true beliefs? More specifically, what is the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable given each of these types of materialism that we have just seen? On non-reductive materialism, the neuronal structure is responsible for causing adaptive behavior and for generating belief content. But what reason do we have to suppose that the belief content thus determined is true? No reason. Natural selection selects for structures that cause adaptive behavior. And it is the same physical process that generates belief content. But whether or not the content is true is irrelevant to fitness. There is no problem in terms of fitness if the content is false. As long as the physical properties are adaptive, it doesn't matter for survival what content is determined by the physical properties. But then, what is the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable given this picture of belief formation? We should suppose that the probability that the content of a given belief is true is roughly 0.5. Given that the probability of a certain belief being true is 0.5, what is the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable? According to Plantinga's estimate, if we have 1,000 independent beliefs, the probability that, given non-reductive materialism, at least 3/4 of these beliefs, the threshold stipulated by Plantinga for reliability, are true, will be less than 10 to the 58th power. And if we postulate only 100 beliefs, the probability of R, given N and E and non-reductive materialism, is 0.00001. On reductive materialism, what is required for a belief to be fitness enhancing is not its truth value, but that the physical properties it has will cause the organism to perform an action that will contribute to its survival. In other words, it doesn't matter in terms of fitness whether the belief is true or not, but only that the neuronal structure causes the appropriate kind of behavior. The result here is thus the same as the one for non-reductive materialism. The probability of R, given N and E and M materialism, will as a result be low in both accounts of materialism. The defeater thesis comprises the second and the third premises of the argument. A rationality defeater for belief A I have is another belief B I acquire, which is such that, given that I hold B, I can no longer rationally hold A. Suppose I read a study that shows that interest in natural theology has actually been in decline, and I come to believe that the data and the methodology used in this study really support this conclusion. This would give me a defeater for my belief that the interest in natural theology is growing. The defeater in question is in the EAAN, is what Plantinga calls a human defeater. To illustrate how such defeaters work, in the case of the naturalist, who sees that the probability of R given N and E is low, suppose there is a drug, call it XX, that destroys cognitive reliability. I know that 95% of those who ingest XX become cognitive unreliable within 2 hours of ingesting it. They then believe more false propositions than true. Suppose further that I come to believe both that I've ingested XX a couple of hours ago, and that the probability of R that I've ingested XX a couple of hours ago is low. Taken together, these two beliefs give me a defeater for my initial belief that my cognitive faculties are reliable. And if I have a defeater for R, that my cognitive faculties are reliable, I have a defeater for any other belief I have. And the same goes for the naturalist, who recognizes that the probability of N and E is low. He acquires a human defeater, a defeater for all his beliefs, including naturalism itself. The naturalist can't appeal to another belief to argue that his cognitive faculties are reliable. Any such other belief would be a product of his cognitive faculties and would be subject to defeat once he recognizes again that he has a defeater for R. The EAAN could also take a narrower form that would suffice to show that naturalism is self-defeating. Suppose belief and behavior would in some way end up being related in a way such that adaptive behavior would yield mostly true beliefs, so that our beliefs that have survival value would tend to be true. This would exclude, of course, beliefs that don't have survival value, and that would include metaphysical beliefs. The belief that naturalism is true is, of course, a metaphysical belief that doesn't seem relevant to survival and reproduction, except as, of course, as Planting equips, to the occasional member of the Young Atheists Club whose reproductive prospects are enhanced by holding the belief that naturalism is true. Typical Planting, all right? So the probability of MR given NNE, where MR stands for metaphysical beliefs, reliably formed and mostly true, is low. In any form then, narrow or broad, the argument would lead to the conclusion that naturalism is self-defeating and cannot be rationally affirmed. But what about the theist? For the theist, if we are the product of a biological evolutionary process, this process was guided by God with the aim of producing creatures in His image. God could have orchestrated the evolutionary process in order to obtain the creatures He wanted to obtain. For the theist, then, the question of the reliability of our cognitive faculties seems unproblematic. This seems to leave us in a very good position to formulate arguments for the existence of God from the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Third section, theistic arguments from the reliability of our cognitive faculties. 3.1, inference to the best explanation. In his lecture notes, 2 dozen or so theistic arguments. Planting includes, as argument K, an argument from the confluence of proper function and reliability. There he merely sketches a theistic argument based on inference to the best explanation. Perhaps then our first task should be to consider the possibility of formulating an argument of this sort, an argument for the conclusion that theism is the best explanation for the reliability of our cognitive faculties. The first step here seems to be the identification of the main contenders. Are theism and naturalism the only live options? In Mind and Cosmos, Thomas Nagel rejects both theism and what he calls materialist naturalism. He defends that materialist naturalism has great difficulty accounting for consciousness and for the reliability of our cognitive faculties. He praises proponents of intelligent design for identifying problems in evolutionary theory, but he doesn't go as far as to endorse the theory and theism. And although he offers some objections to theism, he has acknowledged that his rejection of it is, quote, more emotional than philosophical or rational, unquote. Nagel sketches an alternative to both theism and naturalism constituted by two main elements, panpsychism and natural teleology. According to panpsychism, mind or something like mind is fundamental to the universe, present from the start and in everything, even in elementary particles. Natural teleology says that things are on a path that leads to certain outcomes, that things tend to change in the direction of certain outcomes. And there is, says Nagel, a certain teleological bias in the universe toward the existence of human minds. All Nagel offers is a sketch of how panpsychism and natural teleology would work. And he himself acknowledges that he has no teleological theory of his own to offer, and that it may take a long time for these suggestions to be developed into viable alternatives to theism and naturalism. Elliot Sober points out in his review of Nagel's book, quote, his job as he sees it is to point to a need. Creative scientists, he hopes, will do the heavy lifting, unquote. Catching this promissory note will not be an easy task. As Planting noted in his own review of the book, it's exceedingly difficult to see how saying that elementary particles, in some sense, have minds can help make intelligible, quote, that there should be creatures capable of physics, philosophy, poetry, art, and music, unquote. And the idea that in the absence of God, things could be aiming at some state of affairs rather than others, thank you very much, quote, doesn't seem to make any sense, unquote. A world without God, right, Plantinus, doesn't aim at state of affairs or anything else. John Leslie has proposed an alternative to theism and naturalism in terms of an axiarchic principle, an impersonal principle similar to the Platonic form of the good, that brings into existence things because they are good. But as Richard Swinburne writes, the trouble with this suggestion is that while there are innumerable instances of mundane phenomena rightly explained by a personal or scientific explanation, there are no mundane examples of anything coming into existence because it is good that it should. Food never appears on the table of the hungry because it is good that it should, but only because some person puts it there because he believes it to be good that it should be there. In the absence of criteria for judging the worth of an axiarchic explanation of the existence of the universe, we can have no grounds for supposing that such an explanation is probably true. Much more could be said about these proposals. Suffice to say, however, that as they stand, it seems hard to take them seriously as viable alternatives to theism and naturalism. Is there any other possible contender? I confess I can't see any on the horizon. How could we then formulate an argument for the conclusion that theism is the best explanation for the reliability of our cognitive faculties? Here's one proposal. Premise 1, theism and naturalism are the only viable options we can conceive of as explanations for the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Naturalism cannot adequately explain the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Theism offers an adequate explanation for the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Therefore, probably theism is the best explanation for the reliability of our cognitive faculties. What exactly is meant here by reliability of our cognitive faculties? Cognitive faculties are, as Plantinga put it, powers and processes that produce beliefs or knowledge in us, unquote. They include memory, perception, a priori intuition, introspection, testimony, induction, moral sense, what Thomas Reid calls sympathy, which enables us to know the thoughts and feelings of other people, and what Calvin calls sensu divinitatis, and Aquinas, our natural but confused knowledge of God. So that's Plantinga's list, but I believe that list is correct. I'm buying the list. So a faculty is reliable if it produces mostly true beliefs, presumably more than 2/3 of the beliefs formed. We ordinarily think our faculties are reliable unless there is cognitive disorder or malfunction. Clearly, there are circumstances in which our cognitive faculties do not function as they should, such as when one drinks too much or is under the effect of some medication that interferes with the proper functioning of certain faculties. Moreover, reliability also varies with circumstances. Visual perception of a certain object close at hand is more reliable than perception of the same object at some distance. As we have seen, theism and naturalism seem to be the only viable options here. As Plantinga's defense of the probability thesis seems to show, the probability of R given NNE is low. Naturalism, therefore, doesn't seem to be able to account for the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Theism, on the other hand, seems to offer a perfectly good account of the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Clearly, then, theism seems to be the best explanation for the reliability of our cognitive faculties. A deductive argument. According to Richard Swinburne, quote, there are plenty of valid arguments to the existence of God that are quite useless, because although their premises may be true, they are not known to be true by those who argue about religion, unquote. So my emphasis here on the useless. No, this seems to be an excessively strong claim. Even Alvin Plantinga, who doesn't think arguments are required for rational or warranted theistic or Christian belief, thinks deductive arguments, even when the truth of their premise is merely probabilistic, can be very useful. They can, for instance, serve to bolster, to confirm, perhaps to convince. And as Stephen T. Davis defends in his God, Reason, and Theistic Proofs, the usefulness of an argument for the existence of God should be evaluated according to its purpose. And he goes on to list 5 possible purposes for a theistic argument. First, to show that theists are rational in their belief in the existence of God. Second, to show that it is more rational to believe that God exists than it is to deny that God exists. Third, to show that it is more rational to believe that God exists than to be agnostic on the existence of God. Fourth, to show that it is as rational to believe in God as it is to believe in many other things that atheist philosophers often believe in, for example, the existence of other minds, or the objectivity of moral right and wrong. Or fifth, to show that it is irrational not to believe that God exists. That is, it is irrational to be either an atheist or an agnostic. Timothy McGrew and John, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, so I won't even try. In Natural Theology and the Uses of Argument, that if we represent reasonableness of a belief in terms of probabilities, then an argument would fulfill the first purpose, when the probability of the belief of the argument, given the evidence and the background information, is equal or greater than R for some fairly high value of R, such as 0.9. An argument would satisfy the second purpose if the probability of the belief, given the evidence and the background information, if the probability is greater than 0.5. The third purpose would be satisfied when the probability of the belief, given the evidence and the background information, is closer to 1 than it is to 0.5. So the probability would be greater than 0.75. They represent the fourth criterion in comparative terms. Quote, the probability of the belief, given the evidence and the background information, is equal or greater than the probability of X, given E and K, for some specified widely accepted proposition X, unquote. And the fifth purpose would be satisfied in conditions similar to those of purpose 1, that is, the probability of B, given E and K, is greater than 0.9. They also add that, quote, for deductive arguments, modest conclusions that set any positive lower bound for the conclusion without also setting an upper bound are also acceptable ways to move the discussion forward, unquote. With all that in mind, a deductive argument, a deductive version of a theistic argument from the reliability of our cognitive faculties could be formulated very simply as, if God does not exist, our cognitive faculties are not reliable, our cognitive faculties are reliable, then God exists. It seems the crucial premise here is P1. If God does not exist, our cognitive faculties are not reliable. But in fact, there are non-theists who have responded to Plantinga's evolutionary argument by denying that our cognitive faculties are reliable. Geoff Childers, for instance, claims just that, and adds that this is more consistent with naturalism than with theism. He cites some studies showing circumstances under which the individuals tested formed beliefs influenced by confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, that is, in which they favored information that confirmed their beliefs or hypotheses. I won't have the time to discuss his claims and the data he uses to support them here. Let me just say that all the studies he presents seem to have shown is that we have an incredible ability to deceive ourselves. That's certainly no news, and certainly consistent and even entailed by Abrahamic theism. The fact is, the claim that our cognitive faculties are not reliable is internally incoherent and self-defeating. What seems to lie behind this rejection of P2 is naturalized epistemology at its worst. Childers claims that, quote, the unreliability of our cognition helps explain the usefulness of science, unquote. Here he seems to mean something similar to what Paul Churchland defends in his response to the EAAN. Churchland accepts that the probability of R given N and E is low, but claims that this is not the case when our cognitive faculties are operating in, quote, laboratory circumstances, unquote. That is, under the procedures and institutions of modern science. What Churchland seems to be defending here is that the unreliability of our cognitive faculties would disappear or be corrected during the practice of science. But as Plantinga pointed out, there are essentially three problems with Churchland's system. Let me briefly mention two of them. First, the instruments used in science are designed by us. And if our cognitive faculties aren't reliable, then why think the instruments themselves would be reliable? And even if the instruments were reliable, we would be operating them with the same unreliable cognitive faculties. Second, even when we are in laboratory circumstances, we avail ourselves of and depend on a number of beliefs that are not formed in laboratory circumstances. Churchill's belief that the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable when our beliefs are formed in the laboratory, for example, is a belief formed using rational intuition without the help of any artificial mechanism. So P2 is as strong as a premise can get. What about P1? It seems clear that from the foregoing discussion that naturalism cannot account for the reliability of our cognitive faculties. And if naturalism and theism are the only live options, as it seems to be the case, we have no choice but to say that P1 is true. How good then is this argument? Does it meet Swinburne's criterion for a good argument? If not, which of the criteria proposed by McGrew for satisfying Davis's purposes would be fulfilled by these or alternative formulations of a deductive argument from the reliability of our cognitive faculties? I'll leave that to you. 3.3, an inductive argument. In Warranted and Proper Function of Implantinga presented two arguments against naturalism. The main argument, which included the Führer thesis, seeking to show that naturalism is irrational, and a preliminary argument that sought to show that if you believe that our cognitive faculties are reliable, you have evidence against naturalism and thus for the truth of theism, if you think those are the only live options. Criticisms by Brendan Feitelson and Elliot Sober led Plantinga to reformulate the preliminary argument in warranted Christian belief. According to the new version of the argument, and I'll quote him in full here, we are comparing theism, T, and N, naturalism. So the relevant application of base will be the probability of naturalism given the reliability of our cognitive faculties is the probability of naturalism times the probability of R given N divided by the prior probability of the reliability of our cognitive faculties. And the probability of T given R is the probability of T times the probability of R given T divided by the probability of R, where we are thinking of absolute or logical probabilities. The probability of R will have the same value in each expression. So the question is, how do the probability of N times the probability of R given N and the probability of T times the probability of R given T comparing value? Well, the probability of R given N is low, as I had argued. However, I is Plantinga here, of course. However, the probability of R given T is not. R is just what we'd expect given T. At any rate, we've got no reason for thinking the probability of R given T low. So, given that we don't assign N a considerably higher absolute probability than T, we should take the probability of T on R to be greater than that of N on R. But we do in fact believe R. So we have a reason to prefer T to N. Not perhaps a very strong reason. This doesn't tell us a whole lot about the probabilities of T and N on our total evidence, but a reason nonetheless. It's the same reason, it's the same sort of reason the theologian has for preferring atheism to theism, given that he thinks it's unlikely that a world created by God would display all the evil the world does in fact display. The conclusion, we have seen that the advantage the theist has over the naturalist when it comes to explaining the reliability of our cognitive faculties can furnish us with material not only for a negative case against naturalism, but also for a more clearly positive case in favor of theism. Thank you very much.